On the surface, it was just an ordinary farm, animal barns, muddy fields, and pigs roaming the land. But behind those gates, the nights told a different story. Wild parties raged, with hundreds of guests streaming in, drinking, using drugs, and dancing until dawn. Among the guests were women from Vancouver's downtown Eastside, women who began to vanish, one after another. At first it seemed like a coincidence, but as the years passed, it became undeniable. Women were disappearing, and they all had one disturbing connection. When investigators finally turned their attention to Robert Pickton, the farm was littered with DNA, traces of dozens of missing women, but there was no sign of their bodies. It was as if they had vanished into thin air, and the man at the center of it all wasn't talking. Even with evidence scattered across his property, Robert Pickton refused to confess. The question remained, where were the women, and how could police make him reveal the truth? Welcome back to Prison Stories. Today, we're diving into one of the most disturbing cases in Canadian history, the story of Robert Pickton, the pig farmer turned serial killer. We'll unravel how his farm became the center of a nightmare, how investigators struggled to make him talk, the chilling way police finally got him to confess. Robert Pickton looked like a quiet and withdrawn pig farmer in Port Coquitlam, British Columbia. But there was another side to him that most people didn't see. Together with his brother, he registered a charity called the Piggy Palace Good Time Society. On paper, it sounded harmless, a social club meant for community gatherings. In reality, it became a cover for all-night raves, drunken parties, and drug-fueled chaos. Hundreds of people would crowd onto the property, spilling out of barns and makeshift halls. Bikers, sex workers, and people from Vancouver's downtown East Side mingled there, far from the eyes of police. For many, these parties were just another wild night. But for some women, they would be the last place they were ever seen alive. Rumors began to spread. Women were vanishing, and Pickton's farm kept coming up in whispers. At first, the disappearances were dismissed as runaways, addicts, or women drifting through a hard life. But as the number grew, the coincidences became impossible to ignore. Behind the facade of parties and pigs, something sinister was happening on that farm. Early on, there were chances to stop Pickton. In 1997, a woman escaped from his farm after a violent attack. She was stabbed multiple times but managed to survive. Despite her injuries and testimony, the charges against Pickton were dropped when prosecutors claimed the woman was too unstable to be a reliable witness. That decision allowed him to walk free, and the disappearances continued. By the early 2000s, the crisis could no longer be ignored. Pressure from families, activists, and mounting evidence forced investigators to look more closely at Pickton. They obtained a search warrant for his property, expecting to find weapons. But what they uncovered was far more disturbing. Scattered across the farm were items belonging to missing women. Jewelry, clothing, purses, everyday possessions that should never have been there. And then came the forensic evidence. DNA traces of multiple victims were found on the property, confirming that the pig farm was not just a party ground, but a dumping ground. Even with this mountain of evidence, one thing was missing: the bodies. Without them, police couldn't paint the full picture of what had happened. And when they brought Pickton into interrogation, he gave them nothing. Silent, evasive, refusing to confess. It was as though he believed he could still walk away. Detectives pressed him for hours, showing him photographs of missing women, hoping for any flicker of recognition. They laid out image after image, faces marked missing, blood-soaked scenes, personal effects. But Pickton stared blankly. No flinch, no shaking, no hesitation. He denied knowing their faces. He denied ever having seen them. In those moments, his detachment revealed something more chilling than denial. The photos were people, women with lives, names, families, but to him, they might as well have been objects. This is Mona Wilson's blood. They said his reaction was cool, distant. But that don't mean I did it. After hours of questioning, investigators had hit a wall. Robert Pickton wasn't breaking. The farm was full of DNA, blood traces, and evidence of the missing women. But Pickton himself kept denying, dodging, and slipping into silence. So police turned to a different strategy, one of the oldest tricks in the book, but also one of the riskiest. They slipped an undercover officer into Pickton's jail cell, posing as a fellow inmate. The goal was simple: get Pickton to talk when he thought no one official was listening. Inside the jail cell, the undercover officer played his role flawlessly. He wasn't interrogating. He was bonding. He swore casually, mocked the cops, and griped about the justice system. Bit by bit, Pickton warmed up. The officer steered the conversation toward evidence. He joked about how the police loved digging around, looking for proof. That was the hook. Pickton chuckled, then started pouring facts. He spoke about how investigators would play in the dirt, hinting at where bodies had been buried. For the first time, he wasn't denying, he was gloating. As the small talk deepened, so did Pickton's arrogance. He admitted he had been sloppy, and that's how he got caught. Then came the chilling moment. I was going to do one more, make an even 50. That's when I was going to quit. He called himself a legend, bragging as if murder was an accomplishment. There was no remorse, no hesitation, only pride. What hours of interrogation couldn't achieve, a casual conversation with a cellmate did. When the undercover jail tapes surfaced, they became the most chilling part of the case. Pickton bragged about killing 49 women and mocked investigators, but the prosecution couldn't rely on words alone. The real horror lay in what police had found back on the farm. Human remains were discovered mixed with animal bones, and traces of DNA from dozens of missing women were recovered from freezers, plastic bins, and even buckets. Forensic experts testified that some remains had been butchered and others were so degraded they could only be identified through microscopic fragments. The possibility that Pickton had disposed of victims by feeding them to his pigs, or even rendering their remains, was the only answer to all these questions. Yet these discoveries also created problems. Many victims had vanished years earlier, and sloppy police work during the early disappearances meant that crucial evidence was lost. Defense lawyers seized on these gaps, arguing that without intact bodies, prosecutors couldn't prove murder. They claimed the jailhouse confession was unreliable, that Pickton had been manipulated into bragging, and that investigators were stretching weak evidence to fit a narrative. Faced with this uphill battle, the Crown made a calculated decision. Instead of trying Pickton on all 26 counts of murder, they narrowed the case to 6 charges where the evidence was strongest: DNA, remains, and physical links tying him to the crimes. After a grueling trial that lasted nearly a year, the jury returned a verdict in 2007. Pickton was guilty on 6 counts of second-degree murder. He received life in prison with no chance of parole for 25 years, the harshest sentence allowed under Canadian law. The controversy didn't end with Pickton's conviction. Battles over evidence continued for years. Even as recently as 2024, families went to court to stop police from destroying materials still stored from the investigation, fighting to preserve anything that might offer closure. And then, in May 2024, Robert Pickton died in prison after being attacked by another inmate. For many families, it closed a chapter, but it didn't erase the anger, the grief, or the haunting truth that justice had only been partial. The pig farm has long since been torn apart, sifted, and searched, but the questions it left behind will haunt Vancouver forever. How many women really disappeared into that ground? How many stories were silenced before anyone cared to listen? This case wasn't just about one man's evil. It was about a system that ignored the vulnerable until it was far too late. And in the end, Pickton never showed remorse. He died behind bars in 2024, never giving up the truth he alone carried. Thank you for watching Prison Stories. If you found this case as chilling as we did, subscribe for more true crime documentaries.